Today, Australia's highest-ranking Catholic, Cardinal George Pell, has died. He was 81. Emergency supplies sent to the Kimberley as the clean-up continues from WA's worst flood crisis. The man accused of Toyah Cordingley's murder in Far North Queensland 4 years ago consents to a rapid extradition from India. And Queenslander Jason Kubler continues his golden streak, sliding into the second round of the Adelaide International. Hello and welcome to Mornings on the ABC News Channel. I'm Joe O'Brien. Taking a quick look at the weather first in the capital cities around the nation today. Brisbane mostly sunny with a top of 31. Sydney partly cloudy. Canberra cloud clearing. Melbourne pretty hot, 32. Hobart clear skies and 25. Adelaide cloud clearing and 32 as well. Perth sunshine increasing and Darwin mostly sunny. Mining and energy stocks are leading the Australian market higher. The All Ords is up 0.75%. We'll check the figures in more detail a little later with Alicia Barry. Cardinal George Pell, Australia's highest-ranking Catholic official, has died in Rome. He was 81. From his upbringing in country Victoria, George Pell rose to become the Vatican's treasurer. Often a controversial figure, Cardinal George Pell's final years were tumultuous.
A man of the Church, George Pell rose to become an advisor to the Pontiff in charge of the Vatican's finances. Yet the most searing image of the Cardinal was his appearance before the Victorian courts on charges of child abuse, a crime he maintained he never committed when interviewed by police.
What a load of absolute and disgraceful rubbish. Completely false. Madness.
In December 2018, the Cardinal became the highest-ranking Catholic official to be convicted of child abuse after a jury found him guilty of abusing 2 choir boys during the 1990s while he was the Archbishop of Melbourne. He would later describe what he felt as the jury handed down its verdict.
I was too busy keeping control of myself. It was a blow and I just had to put up with it.
Cardinal Pell spent 405 days behind bars before his convictions were overturned in the High Court. The High Court judges stating it was possible an innocent man had been jailed. In his first interview following his release, George Pell, a conservative Catholic, said he was the victim of culture wars.
Culture wars are real. Unfortunately, there's less rational discussion and there's more playing the man.
The son of a Ballarat publican, George Pell excelled at school and on the sports field. He was even signed to the Richmond Football Club.
Any of the boys interested in the footy?
Oh, yeah. But the call to the priesthood was too great. As an ordained priest and then Archbishop of Melbourne and later Sydney, he rankled progressive Catholics with his conservative message and resistance to reform.
So we're not a bit anti-women, but we're not in favour of women priests.
Anti-divorce, anti-abortion, he also refused communion to gay activists at one of his masses.
Homosexuality, we're aware that it does exist. We believe that such activity is wrong.
But he was an advocate for Indigenous reconciliation and a fierce critic of the mandatory detention of asylum seekers.
I think it's mean and excessively harsh.
His hard line caught the attention of Rome. But his past decisions came to haunt him, such as accompanying one of Australia's worst paedophiles, priest Gerald Ridsdale, to court in 1993. What Cardinal Pell knew about abuse carried out by priests became a pressing question, and one that dominated his evidence before the 2016 Royal Commission.
It's a sad story and it wasn't of much interest to me.
George Pell made a name for himself defending the Catholic Church's handling of abuse cases. He was the architect of the controversial victim compensation scheme called the Melbourne Response. Some critics say his unwavering ambition to reach the top came at the cost of the children who he'd failed to help along the way.
And Europe correspondent Nick Dole joins us now from London. Nick, so details are still emerging. What can you tell us?
Hi there, Joe. Well, this news was announced by Cardinal Pell's personal secretary, who said that the 81-year-old died in Rome on Tuesday night local time. He died in hospital following complications from hip surgery, according to the church. And this does come as a shock, really, because just last week we saw Cardinal Pell in Rome speaking and paying tribute to Pope Emeritus Benedict, who, of course, was laid to rest recently. Cardinal Pell did have his own bouts of ill health, and he has been living a much quieter life since he was released from jail in Australia. But certainly this will be a shock for the Catholic faithful, both in Australia and at the Vatican. He was Australia's most senior ranking Catholic, so his death will be felt by many in the church and more broadly in the community too.
And he was a polarising figure?
Well, yes, he certainly was. Even before Cardinal Pell was accused of child sexual abuse, he was a polarising figure in the community. You know, he said that his direct style probably irritated people, but he made no apologies for defending what he said were God's teachings. And as we've heard, he was particularly hardline on things like homosexuality and abortion. Of course, in 2018, he did become the most senior Catholic to be convicted of child sexual abuse. A court in Victoria found that he had sexually abused 2 choir boys in St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne. Now, that was upheld on appeal, but ultimately it went to the High Court, and the High Court found that a rational jury should not have found him guilty beyond reasonable doubt. It found that there was a prospect that an innocent man had been unjustly convicted, and so those convictions were quashed. So that was a big victory for him, but of course it was not before he'd spent over a year in jail. In his latter career, certainly his supporters say that he was a real reformer in the church, and they praised the work that he did in the Vatican as well, cleaning up the finances there. But certainly his latter years were dogged by those child sexual abuse allegations that ultimately he was cleared of.
And what's been the reaction so far to news of his death?
Well, the news is still filtering through the church community, both here in Europe and in Australia. We have had some reaction from the Sydney Archbishop, Anthony Fisher. He says, "It's with deep sadness I can confirm His Eminence George Cardinal Pell passed away in Rome in the early hours of the morning. This news comes as a great shock to all of us. Please pray for the repose of the soul of Cardinal Pell, for comfort and consolation for his family, and for all of those who loved him and are grieving him at this time." And also the Melbourne Archbishop Peter Comsoli has said, "It's with great sadness that I have learnt that Cardinal Pell, the 7th Archbishop of Melbourne, has died overnight from heart complications following hip surgery in Rome, Italy. Cardinal Pell was a very significant and influential church leader, both in Australia and internationally, deeply committed to Christian discipleship." Cardinal Pell led the local church in Melbourne from 1996 to 2001 with strong leadership to the Catholic faith and with good governance before being transferred to Sydney and then to Rome. At this immediate moment, let our prayer go out to God of Jesus Christ, whom Cardinal Pell wholeheartedly believed in and followed, and he may be welcomed into eternal life. So, Joe, those are just some of the statements coming through from church leaders. As I say, the news is still filtering through. But we're expecting more tributes from various members of the church and wider society, of course. People like the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott was a great supporter of Cardinal Pell. And so as this news filters through the day, we're expecting to hear more reaction from the church community. OK,
Nick Dole there in London. And JD Flynn is the editor-in-chief of Catholic news outlet The Pillar, and he joins us now from Denver in the US. JD Flynn, welcome. So how significant a figure has George Pell been in the Catholic Church over recent decades?
Yeah, that's right. Cardinal Pell, I think it's helpful to understand, has been sort of at the center of some of the most significant things that have happened in the life of the Catholic Church, and especially at the Vatican in recent years. His appointment in 2013 as the first prefect for the Secretariat of the Economy meant that he was essentially charged by Pope Francis with leading the Pope's reform efforts on financial misconduct in the Vatican, which is really the thing Pope Francis was elected to do. So Cardinal Pell, deputized by Pope Francis very early to conduct a very important mission to the Pope and really to the reform of the entire Vatican. And, even after his conviction was overturned and he returned to Rome, he has remained a really influential member of the College of Cardinals. I saw him in Rome just last weekend, and he was entertaining other cardinals, speaking with them about matters in the life of the Church. So even though he was at 81 too old to vote in the next papal conclave, he's been talked about as a person who is thought of as kind of a significant influence on the direction of that conclave, the direction of the Church in many ways, and for many cardinals, really someone who they look to as a mentor and whose guidance they took on ecclesiastical issues.
Jody, you just mentioned you actually saw him in Rome last week. What can you tell us if you had met him yourself, and what were your personal observations of him?
Only very briefly. I saw Cardinal Pell at a few events last week, and he looked very, very lively. I didn't have a chance to talk with him only because we were sort of coming and going in different directions. But he entertained friends in restaurants and was attending the liturgies that connected to the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI. And so this came as a surprise to a lot of people, I think, because he, by all accounts, for an 81-year-old, seemed to be in very strong health. And so this heart attack after his hip replacement surgery, I think, was totally unexpected even for the people who were very close to him and had just been spending time with him.
How key a member was he of the conservative wing within the Catholic Church, and what influence has he had on the course of policy of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, well, Cardinal Pell, in terms of policy, Cardinal Pell outlined the program for financial reform of the Church's administration at the Vatican, and the plays which he called are still sort of being unfolding on the field. And so he was extremely influential in the Pope's agenda of financial reform. And that fact that the Pope tapped him for that work and that he remained influential in that work, I think points to the fact that Cardinal Pell can't really be painted only as a conservative. Certainly he was doctrinally orthodox, and I think a lot of people would say doctrinally conservative. But at the same time, he was a champion of ecclesiastical movements, sort of new movements in the Church that many people would think of as being more sort of cutting edge. He was not by any stretch of the imagination a traditionalist, but really I think a lot of people thought of him as sort of a cardinal of Vatican II. He talked a lot about the significance of Vatican II on his own influence and formation, and again, given the things which the Pope entrusted to him and the work that he did on that front, connected certainly with conservatism on some things, I think it's hard to put him in one box. That's one of the things I think that made Cardinal Pell so influential, is that he was outspoken, certainly on public affairs. I think certainly in Australia he would have been regarded as a conservative, but within the life of the Church also took positions on a reforming agenda that took many people for surprise, and then again championed kind of the reforms and changes of the Second Vatican Council.
And he's also been a controversial figure in Australia. There are many parishioners who were extremely frustrated at how they were dealt with allegations and instances of children being abused. Allegations against him were quashed, but he had responsibility as Archbishop of Melbourne through a period of dealing with allegations. How was he seen within the Church in terms of how he handled that and the controversy in Australia?
Yeah, but I talked with Australian Catholics today who said, look, certainly it's true that during the time that Cardinal Pell especially was Archbishop of Melbourne, there are cases which he himself, or Auxiliary Bishop of Melbourne, there are cases which he himself would have handled differently with greater knowledge. He said he didn't think that was a problem institutional, sort of endemic to the Church, but a problem broadly with the way that we as a society have sort of evolved in the way that we think about abuse and its handling. But at the same time that I think Cardinal Pell himself expressed regret for some elements of his handling of some cases, there are a lot of Australian Catholics who pointed out to me today that he was instituting policies on safeguarding and victim assistance in Melbourne and Sydney that were really ahead of their time. So I don't think it's all one thing. I think there are things where the Cardinal himself looked back on his life and said, I didn't handle these things as I would handle them now. And then there are other things where he was really ahead of the game in terms of addressing safeguarding, and certainly ahead of civil institutions, beyond the church. And so, again, at least as I talk with Australian Catholics, they say they really revere him on some fronts for those things. And certainly at the same time, there are victims who say that they didn't feel heard or didn't feel that Cardinal Pell understood or took seriously the allegations that they made, which is, I think, something that the whole church has to take seriously.
Yeah, you say there are some people who think he was ahead of the game, as your description, in terms of dealing with cases of abuse. But yeah, there were people in Australia who were extremely upset and distressed at how they were treated.
Sure, I think both things are true. It can't be denied that the safeguarding policies and victim assistance policies that Cardinal Pell instituted were ahead of their time and helped to usher in policies which became standard not only in the church but in other public institutions as well. But at the same time, no, it certainly is the case that there are victims who say, and I think should be believed and taken seriously, that their efforts to make allegations to the church were not heard and reported. And I think Pell's own admission that there were certain things which he wishes he could have done differently certainly, doesn't negate that.
Where do you think the Catholic Church stands now in its ability to take seriously complaints and deal with those complaints and adequately compensate people who have been abused and families of victims who've been traumatised?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, that's where I spend most of my work. As much of our journalistic work at The Pillar is focused on investigating the church's handling or mishandling of clerical sexual abuse. And today, I think that the place where the church is most in need of reform is on handling the abuse of adults, vulnerable adults, or those who have a pastoral relationship and can be manipulated as a result of that. And very honestly, I think the Vatican and dioceses around the world still have real efforts of reform to make to address those things. I think it's certainly true that the church's safeguarding policies with regard to the protection of children, certainly in the United States, are ahead of the safeguarding policies of other institutions, of public schools and other institutions. But for the Catholic Church, that can't be enough. And there's a need for continued reform and very serious reform on safeguarding issues, especially with regard to the abuse of adults and seminarians and others who are in vulnerable positions. And the Vatican, very honestly, has a lot of questions to continue to answer about its own track record on those things, going all the way up to Pope Francis. And so I don't think we can say that this is an issue of the past, but an issue that the Catholic Church still has to reckon with very seriously today.
Okay, JD Flynn, thanks so much for talking to us from Denver, Colorado.
Thanks for having me.